Good morning, this is Prof. Landmesser from the EHJ Update 2015 Davos. We are here at EHJ Today, and it's a great pleasure to have with me Professor Stuart Pocock from the University of London, who is a professor of medical statistics and just gave at this meeting the opening lecture, the Paul Lichtlen lecture, on the society needs from clinical trials. I think you can see already from that you were scheduled as the opening lecture that this is a highly important topic to the cardiovascular field, where you have been instrumental in many clinical trials. What is your perspective to start out? What we need, what are the most urgent needs for clinical trials in the cardiovascular field for our society?
Well, it's always a challenge to try and define what to do next and how to improve on the current state of the art. I think we know that the great majority of clinical trials that get conducted are sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry or the medical device industry. And they have particular needs to get their drugs and devices licensed by the regulatory authorities, such as the FDA and the EMA in Europe. But what they need to do, and what would be the trials that would best enhance patient benefit, are not automatically the same thing. So in industry-sponsored trials, it's typical to add on to background therapy a new drug of the industry's product versus placebo. So you're always adding new drugs on top of existing therapy. So the end result is patients end up taking more and more drugs, for instance in heart failure, and do they need them all? And that's an interesting challenge which the current design of industry-sponsored trials doesn't really tackle.
I mean, you clearly pointed out in your excellent lecture this morning that there are, for example, no data whether elderly patients need to continue, for example, on beta blocker therapy if they have coronary disease. How do you envision such a trial of basically trying to reduce medication in elderly patients?
Well, it's an important challenge because beta blocker trials, when they were first done, had a limited duration of follow-up. So the knowledge of the benefits of beta blockers is over at most 5 years follow-up. But the practice is to continue use of beta blockers much longer than that with patients with stable coronary disease, for instance. So what we really need to do is recognize that the side effect profile from beta blockers might increase with age, and therefore we need trials to examine whether we can withdraw beta blocker from patient combination of drugs without doing harm. So we need a randomized trial in an appropriate stable disease population where we would randomize patients who are already on a beta blocker for some years to either withdraw from beta blocker or continue on it. And we could follow them up for a few years, maybe 2-3 years, to see whether it's a neutral finding or actually staying on beta blocker is actually causing more side effects. And it's how we can get the cardiological community interested in these important questions in the elderly. Nothing much happening as yet.
One issue, as you mentioned, is of course the financing of the trials. So of course the majority of trials is financed by the drug company or the device industry, so such a trial would not be financed by industry, most likely. So how should we go ahead for the financing of such important clinical trials?
Well, we need public funds. We need more public funds for the unanswered questions, of which there are many on non-industry motivated trials. And so they can come from national governments, from charities. In the UK, the British Heart Foundation, for instance, has a very successful record of doing important trials. And also the European Community money. The recent Horizons 2020 program has stimulated a number of new trial projects. So there are mechanisms whereby we can fund such trials, but there's never enough money to go around, the sad state of affairs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you pointed out this, that for some trials there's a disconnect between the society need and basically the understandable need of the company to license the drug, and maybe that may influence also the trial design to become not optimal from a society standpoint. So how do we reconcile these different interest in the trial design? Do you envision another institution helping us to basically design the trials more in the society need?
Well, any major trial is a collaboration with multiple disciplines. You have the company itself, you have the academic cardiological community, you have medical statisticians like myself, and you also have the regulators, the FDA and the EMA, for instance. There's a powerful combination there that could influence what the trial design is that the industry are going to support. For instance, in trials that led to the greater use of the anticoagulant bivalirudin were originally geared towards bivalirudin being compared with essentially too toxic a combination of heparin plus GPI, and that combination led to excess bleeding. Now, if the regulators and everyone had been smarter, they would have had bivalirudin versus heparin head on and see what happened. And that didn't happen because everybody was too slow to get their head round what needed to take place. And so the company was able to pursue their own preferred design. So we could influence things, all of us.
I think you made that very clear. That leaves us basically in clinical practice now open, the question open what we should do, or whether there's a true advantage of biliverdin in these patients, despite we have such a large trial. So that's, of course, a problem. I was wondering what you think about these double antiplatelet trials that you presented. So we have now the situation that we have some benefit on reduction of ischemic events with prolonged antiplatelet therapy, also from the meta-analysis, but at the same time an increase in bleeding risk. So we have to value basically efficacy and safety risks and how we should pursue this in clinical practice. What would you think is the best way to handle this information? Because some patients may benefit, but others may be harmed, and we cannot probably do the same strategy for all patients.
Yes, there's a complex mix there. The first starting point is there's not enough of a connect between the trials research and what actually takes place in routine clinical practice. We have found through registries that far too high a proportion of patients who've had PCI are still on dual antiplatelet therapy 2 years later, which doesn't match very well with the guidelines. I think what happens is patients, after their interventionist has left them in peace, are left in the hands of primary care physicians who don't implement the guidelines very clearly. The recent evidence suggests that by stopping antiplatelet therapy, at least stopping the dual part of it, as soon as 3 months after the PCI took place, it may be possible because there's a trade-off between the increased risk of stent thrombosis by going off antiplatelet therapy at that point, but there is a decreased risk of bleeding by doing so. So there's an important trade-off between maintaining efficacy by staying on dual antiplatelet, but causing more bleeding in the process. And I think the bleeding risks have been rather underrated in interventional and cardiological practice.
Absolutely. But the question is if you see a chance like for a score to help practicing clinicians to see which patients the benefit may be more for prolonging antiplatelet therapy and which patients the bleeding risk may be not permissive of doing such a strategy. So the question is if we can optimize this individualization of the therapy with by help of a score, for example.
That's very much still in the future because we don't have such scores readily available at the moment. I think what we need is to combine good common sense with a score as a backup, whereby you can look at the patient's individual risk of stent thrombosis or MI, separately determine their individual risk of bleeding, and see what the trade-offs are. For instance, elderly women, other things being equal, have a higher risk of bleeding. And therefore it may be that they should not be maintained on dual antiplatelet as long as a younger middle-aged man, for instance. And so we need to take those issues into account better.
If I can get you from you one concluding vision, what do you think is the main challenge now we face to improve clinical trials in the cardiovascular field in the near future?
A tough question. I think it is that everybody who is involved in trials asks whether this trial, the trial's results will really improve patient management. And there are some trials that are there, which are funded by industry, which may not directly help patients. And so I think everyone needs to think when they're involved in a new trial, how good is it going to be for the patients? And to step back from that, get more engaged in what trials need to take place. So to influence the funders more by getting the right trials done.
Thank you very much. It was great to have you at the European Heart Trial. Thank you very much again.
Fine, thank you.